Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for October 9th, 2023. I'm going to be discussing today what's needed in the world more than ever, which is the courage to change axioms. And in bringing this topic up, I'm going to be elaborating on what Helga Zepp-LaRouche said the other day, actually yesterday, which is that the global strategic crisis will become increasingly dangerous until action is taken to address the systemic breakdown of the Western economic system, the transatlantic economic and financial system, which is rapidly moving to a new crisis point. Now, when we look at the relationship between economic crisis and war, it becomes obvious why she's saying this. The period of economic breakdown is very often the moment in which wars are launched. And we see this in particular in what's happening now in Southwest Asia, also known as the Middle East. The immediate trigger was the Hamas attack on Saturday on Israel. But this is putting the entirety of Southwest Asia on a trigger point. It's a theater for war. There's an escalation from Israel. There are warnings from Hamas, Hezbollah, and others. But we're also seeing the Biden administration sending the Gerald Ford carrier strike group into the Eastern Mediterranean, which could indicate the degree to which the United States could become involved in fighting there. Now, what Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, had to say is that Israel will engage in a, quote, long and difficult war, unquote, against Hamas. And in a sense, he formally declared war. He talked about this as a mighty vengeance. And the defense minister of Israel said today that there will be a complete siege, including tightening the boycott, which means no power, no water, no food, no medicine allowed into Gaza. The attack on Saturday occurred 50 years, one day after the 50-year anniversary of the Yom Kippur War in 1973, at which point Egypt and Syria attacked Israel together, crossing the Suez Canal to take the Sinai and the Golan Heights, both of which areas were taken by Israel after the 1967 war. Now, there are a number of things to look at here, and we just have a preliminary evaluation. It's going to take some time to dig through this and get more detail. But the important question is, who benefits from a war like this? Who could possibly use a war like this for their advantage? Now, some are comparing this to the 9/11 terror in the United States, but they're also comparing it to what happened in 1973, that the intelligence of the community in Israel in 1973 and the intelligence community in the United States in 2001 were, quote, blindsided, unquote. That is, they were unaware of the events to come, and that this became part of the whole narrative, an intelligence failure. And this time we have the Egyptians saying that they had warned the Israelis of, quote, something big coming, unquote. And yet the Israelis were supposedly caught off guard. So as I said, it's too early for a full analysis of this, but let's review some of the background. First, what exists in that part of the world is what's called a frozen conflict. That is, since the 1947-48 wars, a series of wars, including the Suez Crisis in 56, the 1967 Six-Day War, the 1973 Yom Kippur War, the failure of the Oslo Accord in 1993, there's been no resolution of the Palestinian problem, so-called, which is that the Israelis have insisted on keeping the Palestinian population without power, without access to economic development, in a sense, what some people call an apartheid state, separate but unequal status, and so on. The important point here is that a frozen conflict is one which can erupt at any point in time. And I'm bringing this up because some are saying that this would be the solution for Ukraine. as opposed to a fully negotiated diplomatic solution, which includes an economic component. Now, the Oslo Accord is important because in 1993, what the alliance between Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin as the government of Israel allowed was a negotiated settlement which would have included land for peace, but more importantly, there were economic accords which were a part of it. And the economic accords included industrialization of the Palestinian territories and full development of economic potential. Now, this is what was agreed to with Bill Clinton presiding over the ceremony at the White House between the famous handshake between Rabin and Arafat, where Rabin famously spoke of the importance of the courage to change axioms. That is, that if you live in a situation where you constantly exist with this shadow of war over your head and a sense that war would be justified by the failures on both sides, you never solve the problem. And this is what Rabin and Peres and Arafat tried to do with an economic annex to the Oslo Accord, which was never fulfilled. Why? Well, because the IMF and the World Bank would not allow it, but neither did the United States. The United States made no effort to ensure that the economic aid would go there, which could allow for an industrialization of the Palestinian area. Now, in April 1994, Lyndon LaRouche gave a speech in Moscow in which he laid out what was called his Oasis Plan. And I'm going to append an article on this to the description page today for you to see what LaRouche was talking about in 1994 as a solution to what many people said could not be solved, namely the Israel-Palestine crisis. Keep in mind that Israel-Palestine crisis goes back to the turn of the 20th century, in particular, the agreement that was made by the British in 1917, 1918 to allow for the establishment of a Jewish state. And this became the basis of British intervention, which included the redrawing of maps in the whole region, the use of a clash of civilizations outline that is over the top of everything. The idea that you couldn't really have a peace, that nations would be divided among religious, ethnic, tribal, and so on. And so the Balfour Agreement in 1917 opened the doors for that. The imposition of the Saudi family as the rulers of the Arabian Peninsula, combined with all sorts of machinations, including the establishment of the State of Israel as it was done, the wars that were carried out. There was no attempt to solve this by moving into a new development policy which could have brought peace to the region. And then, of course, in 1995 was the assassination of Rabin by extremist Israelis, which at that point plunged Israel into a political crisis which has not been solved since then, and it's largely resulted in the almost permanent position of Benjamin Netanyahu, who's a greater Israel extremist in the position as Prime Minister of Israel. Now, what's the immediate context for this? Well, let me just go through a couple of quick points. The collapse of the Unipolar Order, the failure of the United States and its NATO puppets to win the war in Ukraine and to sustain the power of the Unipolar Order. This is collapsing. Perhaps a war in the Middle East with the United States involved, in the thinking of some of the British and others, is that this would give the Unipolar Order the authority to reestablish its global dominance. There's also the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and some are saying Iran is behind this attack. You have to think about this. What does Iran gain from this attack? What happens if the Saudi-Iran rapprochement goes out the window? And the Saudi-Iran rapprochement is also related to the emergence of the BRICS, because at the last BRICS summit last month, You had the new countries who were added to the BRICS included Egypt, included Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran. And so this was a diplomatic economic initiative that would provide a basis for peace based on the economic development perspective of extending the Belt and Road Initiative into the region, but also just the overall approach of peace being dependent on economic development. And then finally, you have the deepening financial crisis. And I'll talk more about this later in the week, but there are warnings in all major business and economic publications that the instability of the bond market, the failure of high interest rates to stop inflation, the closing down of whole sectors of the productive economy throughout the West, that this is leading to a new financial crisis which is greater than that of 2008 or 2019. So what's obvious in this situation is that those people who are committed to peace must redouble the efforts around the Schiller Institute's International Peace Coalition to replace the Unipolar Order with a new strategic and development architecture. And I'll be appending, as I said, the article on the Oasis Plan by Lyndon LaRouche, plus 2 articles I wrote after Oslo that identify the way out of this crisis, the nonlinear thinking that's required as opposed to falling back into partisan talking points. You know, the laughable attempt to blame Biden for this crisis. Biden's not doing anything to solve it, but this was there long before Biden, and it's a bipartisan in the United States. Remember, Kissinger used the 1973 war as the basis of establishing the whole petrodollar system. So you have to think strategically and from the top and not fall into simple answers. So we'll be filling out the picture as it unfolds during the rest of this week. So thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you tomorrow.